We are back with another season 3 episode of Lean by Design podcast. My name is Oscar Gonzalez alongside my co-host Lawrence Wong. And today, Lawrence, at its core, we are talking about the challenges and some of the issues that we see when running teams. And we're not, as I started to look through what we had written down, it's not so much teams that we are a part of. Usually those teams, they define their own rhythm, their own communication style internally to their function, to their department. But when you start looking across functions where there are differences in experience, differences in technical expertise, differences in their history, in where they came from in biopharma, in academia, through their science, through their education, you start to hit a lot of friction points, especially when you might be on a team that has, a set of 10 alphas and you have a project lead or a program lead or a program manager and some associates and some technical leads that span different spaces. Who gets to make the final call? Who gets to decide which direction the project is going to go? Does everything have to go to leadership? What can be decided here? I think we have both been a part of very complex teams that are running multi-million-dollar projects. And unfortunately, no matter how good your launch is, the success really comes in those 1,000 strokes in between the beginning and the end of that program.
Yeah, I mean, it gets very complicated when you have to coordinate with all these different groups and everybody's expertise is different. I guess knowledge of what actually needs to be done, I think, is different too, because everybody has a different view of what the actual project is and the scope. And so, just coordinating a bunch of human beings is very complicated to begin with. But when you have a situation where the end or the proposed state is very unclear, I think that just adds to the confusion. And then obviously, if we're going to make this journey together to get to wherever we need to be, we all need to decide, when to sequence certain things so that we're all in lockstep with what needs to get done, because they're obviously on a project schedule, certain things have to occur so that other things can occur downstream. And I think people often think, oh, I'm in this department, so I just do this one thing. And then another group is probably looking for feedback or some sort of deliverable from another group. And so it gets more and more complicated as you add to the volume of people involved and the complexity of whatever the project is actually going to be.
It's when the cross-functional becomes dysfunctional. That was something I wrote down here, and that's a lot of what happens where, you start off kind of hot, but then I don't know if it's sort of shiny object where you feel like all eyes are on you because you're getting started. And then as you get moving 3, 4, 5 months, the end goal that is 18 months, 2 years away, in this particular phase of the program or the project, it sort of fades away. It becomes like a distant memory. And the focus is on the next thing. What's tomorrow? What's the next meeting? What are the data points that I need to come up with for the next meeting? And I think this represents a risk where we're not aware enough of where we're trying to be. And so we're creating these checkpoints to again, check yourself against your goals. But when you fail to sort of revisit these goals, not just when leadership is asking for, but with a regular cadence to make sure that you are embodying what your target actually is, not how you're going to get there. Because how you're going to get there, you're going to have to pivot. Because no matter how well we plan, we can't plan for the unknown, especially the unknown of unknowns. We don't know if something's going to change in regulatory space. We don't know if something's going to change in the leadership space. We don't know if the research at our organization will just spontaneously change. You can't really think about those things, but you do have to have some level of expectation that there will be a pivot somewhere. Understand what that pivot means in the context of achieving those goals. So it's really important. And I think you brought up a good point where we don't, it's often like we don't ever know what is at the end of the line. And there could be team changes that happen in here. So when you introduce those new people, are you going the extra mile and it's not even going the extra mile. It should be foundational. You got a new team member. Here's what the goal is. Here's where we have been. Here's where we had to pivot. Here's what we're trying to do now. Give them some semblance to ground themselves in this larger project, especially if their particular function is not necessarily the most active one at this stage. But that information is probably going to be useful for them to plan the next stage that happens in that program. So, we're talking about here cross-functional project execution. And so let's tease those pieces out. Cross-functional, and that lends to multiple disciplines, multiple areas of technical expertise, and some areas of management expertise, because those are different things there. Projects, so we're talking about something that has a beginning and has an end. And typically there is a goal for that particular project. It's not just to stop working. There is an endpoint that usually rolls into some larger corporate objective. If you're running projects that don't support your corporate objectives, I would challenge you to reconsider what your project is actually doing in the context of those objectives, or that might be something you don't want to spend resources on. And then execution. These things are not good enough to plan well. It's going to take the execution. And when you talk about kickoffs and having healthy kickoffs, those are critical to getting everyone aligned at a single point in time in the beginning. But the execution comes to the entire 18, 24 months that you're working on that project. But the only thing people can remember is at the end. Was it successful? Was it a failure? And they look at that point at the end of that time as a measure of what happened, and less about how well the team was executing. Because you can get to the end and just have bad luck. Either it didn't translate well because systems beyond our understanding were at play. Perhaps the regulators wanted something different that you were unaware of. I don't know. But it's important for us to really, when we're talking about this, that we're not just talking about the front, we're not just talking about the end, we're talking about everything in the middle, because that's where the dysfunction comes in.
Yeah, and I'll add, you talked about the time piece and having a start and end, and obviously the execution is important. I think the two other pieces I would add are these projects have a fixed budget, right? We don't have an unlimited well of cash to keep throwing at a project.
Right.
And there's a finite number of people involved, right? We can't have the entire company focus on one project because that would be wildly inefficient and not possible to execute on other projects that are also going on in parallel. So, the execution part is that's a tricky one because, for a team to get from A to B, you have to, on average, make a series of good decisions to get to the end. And to your point before, right? Like it's okay to make a good decision and have a not so good outcome, but to execute poorly and then somehow get lucky to have a great outcome, it confuses you, and people think that, oh, this is actually the right way to do things. But I think
so
that's
why we do it again?
Right. Can we do it again? Right.
We did that on this project. I've heard that.
Right. And not actually looking at the strategy and like, did we actually make the right decisions to get us to this point? That's where the very beginning of setting up the project and the coordination among the different groups, governance, right? How decisions are made, how those decisions are communicated, are going to be very important. And not just, let's progress even past when the project is created. There's that whole maintenance aspect that I think a lot of people forget is there's never a project where the people involved in the beginning are all the same people at the end. And so people are going to be coming in and out. And so you got to really think about how you integrate those different parties that are involved in the project as well.
That's right. It's the way that projects are designed now in order to have the biggest impact of your resources. There's sort of this coming in the door and leaving the door and coming in the door. Well, you don't need somebody with this expertise until you get to this layer. And then they're there for 6 months to get you to this next space. And then they go off to something else. So if you're not, I completely agree with you. If you're not paying attention to the team changes that are going to happen and how you're going to navigate that into bringing them into the group, bringing them into the culture, acknowledging what their role is going to be and their expertise. And, in some cases, like, this person is more technically sound than you. So now that you have been speaking up on behalf of this type of function, you need to sort of back up because now the expert is here and you need to take more in of what they're saying, of what their decisions are, and understand that in the context of what you have to do for that project. Because usually those individuals, mostly a program manager, project manager, they're going to be there for most of the time, if possible, because that continuity is really key to having this execution of the project to be more fluid. They have the historical knowledge from the beginning, through any changes that have happened. So I think that's one of the key roles that is important to, and it doesn't happen in every scenario, in every situation. Sometimes there are, bigger projects that get pulled in, and that person might be more experienced. So they're going to say, hey, we're going to pull you out of this one that's just starting to run this one that we really need some serious help. So that kind of thing might happen. But you nailed it. We forget so much how critical the maintenance is because it's boring. It's not fun. It's not exciting. We have a year's worth of work to get through. And when you see that, I think a majority of us take a deep breath and go, okay, we have a year. Let's just move through and check the boxes that we need to. When there should be this sort of steady pace at which you are developing your assets. And to do that, there has to be that communication. There has to be that decision making. That has to be that sort of rallying around each other as a group to make sure that you're hitting these markers along the way. And so when these things don't really pan out, you see progress in the way of timeline, money spent. Maybe we get to certain milestones, but it just feels hard. It feels sticky. It feels every time we make progress, we have to stop and go back. I don't know if you've been a part of any projects that did this, but I know I've been a part of a few where we start off the project saying, okay, this is more of a waterfall approach. We're going to run some experiments, check out this data. That is going to allow us to funnel. This happens very often with like high throughput. You have to funnel from screening thousands of possible, genomic signatures, and you want to try to get to 5 or 10 at the end of the line. And as you're moving down, you see some of our favorites have fallen off. And then you'll see some folks that want to bring that one back into play, even though the data has suggested otherwise. And what happens? You start to create exceptions. Well, it's not always a guarantee. So we want to do this. So now you are sort of going back on decisions that you made to move through the funnel. And so you're now you're introducing variables that were not intended to be variables in this area of discovery. Have you experienced anything like that where there were decisions that were made and then as you're moving through the project, it's like, well, let's go back and bring this in, almost like a self-doubt on the decisions that were made previous?
Yeah, I think I probably see less of that and more of decisions not being made and then kind of leaving that up in the air, right? So there are things that come up on projects that I think what usually happens is the group tries to come to some consensus on like how we should move forward, and then they go, oh yeah, let's put it on this raid log or something. And then what happens is it sits there and then nobody gets assigned, and so there's like zero accountability as to who is actually responsible for making that decision. And I get it, right? There's people that are assigned. One scenario might be that it might be a lead of a work stream that is working on multiple different projects, right? And so their capacity is kind of constrained with, I just have a backlog of things I need to decide on. But they often forget like that decision that you're not making is actually holding up a whole bunch of other group of people that I need to do their work. And so there's this like resource allocation problem, I think, that usually happens that is very closely tied to the decision that has not been made. Now, back to your point about decisions that have been made and then going back and like questioning that. Okay, well, there usually is, if you're on a good project, there is some sort of traceability on like the logic behind the decision being made, and you can kind of follow the breadcrumbs. And if you need to revisit that decision, then you would
Hopefully,
go to that point. Hopefully, right? You have that
hopefully.
log. But if you don't, then you end up in this situation where you're having to go fact finding and like doing an investigation on how did we
What
get to
was
this
the
point, and
source?
like
What did we
exactly.
present to leadership? This is a different version.
Right. Yeah. So there's this ambiguity is like who made this decision? What were they considering at that point? And it's important, like we were talking about at the beginning, right? To really set the stage on this is where we are and like this is where we're going, and then be able to track those like key decisions as you go through. And one of the other points that I didn't get to mention as you were talking was you mentioned project manager, right? So let's talk about the difference between a project manager and a project lead, because I feel like sometimes the project lead may not take the accountability and responsibility to make decisions on how a project is supposed to go, and give that to the project manager. And then you have the
Mhm.
other way around where the project manager goes, "Oh, well, that's the project lead's decision to make." And so there's this like
Right,
confusion, right? Like who
right,
is the person that's going to make the
right.
call on this?
Right. I mean, and so if we're looking at those differences, I think you find project leads in sort of more mature project focused companies. And in those project leads usually have more scientific background because they are sort of combining the experience of, whatever research is happening with the latest understanding of this area of science or research, how things might be changing. You know, I suggest that we start looking into, oral, can we make this into an oral therapy? Because we just saw the FDA struck down the latest injectable, blah, blah, blah. They sort of have this more strategic lens. I think what I have noticed in my experience is that there is this sort of back and forth tug of war between project leads and project managers, where certain aspects of the project lead sort of live into a program manager and then vice versa. And in certain cases where the project manager might surface something, the project lead might say, no, you have to get those things through me. So, what are we talking about here? We're talking about unclear decision rights. What can be decided by who versus what are those things that need to be surfaced? And when we give these descriptions, I think it's important to include examples as opposed to just being like, well, anything that has to do with strategy. That could be absolutely anything. Can we get a little bit more specific? Okay, if you guys are thinking about the modality, or if we don't have a therapeutic and you guys want to explore specific therapeutics, yes, those are all strategic directions that we need to have conversations on, because obviously, depending on the therapy, depending on the patient population, you are going to be directing your traffic of your research to go in a certain direction. Authority shifts depending on the context. So who should be speaking on behalf of the team to who? Who should be speaking on behalf of the science? Who should be speaking on behalf of the operations? How are we going to operate this project? How are we going to execute this project? And a lot of times we leave that up to, the managers that put us on a team rather than the team itself. The team needs to have some level of self-governance. Hey, you know what? We know we have to do these 10 or 15 things. This person is an expert in XYZ, so we're actually going to use them to help us with X. It may not be the role that their function typically has. It might be another, sort of side quest, if I want to put that there, but it is indirect, in line with what needs to be done in the project. And we haven't even talked about sort of rework, the normalization of rework and meetings that begin to substitute for decision making. I saw just the other day, it was somebody on Instagram and they We're like, so now I have a meeting. I had just had a meeting that didn't go from a decision. They wanted me to create a new scenario. So now I have to meet with all of my leads to create the scenarios, to then surface this to a subcommittee to get buy-in from them on the strategy or on the redesign of the plan that we did, before we go to the governance to get their blessing, that then we can go and ask for the money. And so when you talk about changing a plan, getting all those people in the same room, those things unfortunately can take you 2 to 3 months. Yet we look at what slowed the project down. We look at those one or two things. I heard the term just recently, funny enough, of recency bias. You're just biased to what happened in the last 3 months, 5 months, and you're forgetting that, wow, we made a change and it took us 3 months to get that change approved. So that's 3 months of work that you're not really going at your capacity. It's going against what you budgeted, because now these sets of people, they're not even really working. We're sort of exchanging ideas on the strategy and getting feedback probably from too many people. Because again, the goal doesn't have to change, but the way that you approach it can change. And those are the things, I think those are some of the challenges that we face.
Yeah, I think so. There's, we talked about the difference between the project lead and project manager. I think it's safe to say that normally what will happen is that you'll have multiple, I'll call them project leads or work stream leads, that have to coordinate with the particular project manager, right? So, they're probably much more involved in the nuts and bolts and the technical details around how those different work streams are supposed to do things. And a good analogy I think of is like on a football team. If you're on offense, the quarterback having to interact with the offensive line, having to interact with the receivers, and then the head coach drawing the plays. You got the guys in the booth who are looking at the defense, and all of that has to be in sync for you to be able to execute on those 4 downs that you have. We can't, go timeout and then have a discussion here, have a discussion there. You'll never score. You'll turn the ball over.
Never get downfield.
Never get downfield, right? And so I think we have, for a lot of projects, there are mechanisms to escalate things and communicate issues, but I don't think we talk enough about what is the expected time to decide on when we resolve this thing. Because sometimes it's like, oh, I got to meet with this person, I got to meet with this other person, and they got to decide. But having that standard, I think, is very important. Like we talked about in the beginning, what is the expectation? What is the standard for when we run into issues? How long are we going to sit on something like this? And if it exceeds a certain time, then it deserves higher priority. And being able to look at the roadblocks that you have in decision-making ambiguity and prioritize those things, right? Not everything that comes up in a project will deserve the right amount of attention, right? There are certain things that come up that are much more important than other ones. I'm not saying that they should be ignored, but you got to have a way to prioritize them and to make somebody accountable. I think another hot take that I have here is this idea, these matrix teams drive me nuts, because you have all these people that work on 6 different projects, and it's like, how can you have the brain power and the bandwidth to execute, strategize, and keep on top of your work stream if you're doing 6 other things at the same time? It just that always blows my mind, and it's such a generally accepted thing, not just in biotech, but in tech and in other
multiple
industries as well. And, right, multiple industries. And I think that's got to be considered as one of the factors that play into people either not making decisions, making the wrong decisions, taking too long to make a decision. All of these things come into play is thinking about the person on the other end who is ultimately accountable. What other things are you dealing with other than the task at hand, right? Is something that needs to be talked about as well.
It's I love that perspective on sort of the timing on decisions. If we can't make a decision within a certain amount of time, it has to automatically get escalated, because you're right. I think we sit in this sort of limbo where it says we're supposed to surface these things to a committee or to leadership. And just like any committee, they're going to try to create a schedule. Why? Because typically there's leadership involved, and to do ad hoc committee meetings becomes very difficult. Calendars are very full. I have my own thoughts on that, but that's for another time. So I love the approach of, sort of like we have X amount of time to make decisions based on resources. So headcount, people, systems, or technology, money, and sort of that whole bucket, and saying, okay, well, what can we decide on? How quick do we have to make these decisions? And then to that end, if we can't make the decisions, we need to escalate. I think part of what has grown in this culture is this and this is in all levels. This is not just small. This could be medium. This is also in, we're seeing it in some large spaces where perhaps too many decisions are being made without considering other stakeholders or what the downstream impacts could be. But I find in those early days where you're bringing in, there's every company has the best of the best, right? Except when it comes to decisions, I want everything to come up to me. Well, now you become the bottleneck. So why did we go slow? Because you wanted decisions to come to you. And I would be shocked to find the majority of people feeling that they get all the information they need to make a decision. And I think that gray area is a big area of discomfort for people. They don't want to make a decision that a leader will frown upon or come back on. But again, you have to understand what is the risk if you make the decision now. Well, the risk is that we run, experiments for 2 weeks that they disagree with. Okay, that doesn't sound like the end of the world. What is what happens if you make a bad decision here? Well, we might present something to a partner that they overwhelmingly disagree on and decide to shut down the project. Okay, that's probably something that demands some additional attention outside of just the group. So we have to always think about these decisions and where we feel the ambiguity and where we understand the line to be in terms of what we can decide in house. And if you're having challenges, there should be an escalation path to say, hey, if we can't make the decision at the team meeting and I have a one-on-one with my leads of that group and we still can't make a decision, we have to agree that that's going to get escalated. Because then you need some third party, somebody in leadership, and it doesn't have to be going to a committee. There could be some other way to develop this level of governance because, like you said, you can't call timeout on everything to get a decision or to get buy-in from everybody. Because the reality of it is, number one, buy-in or weigh-in does not require everybody. Just a few, because no matter what, we are in a space that is going to make a lot of decisions that we will wish we had far more information to make that decision than we do. That is the nature of the work that we do. Otherwise, if you wanted to get all of the data you need to make all of the decisions you need, you're probably going to exceed that 10-year timeline to getting a drug to market by a lot. So
yeah, I think the what you're getting at is the value of perfect information versus the risk of actually making the decision itself, right? So, the longer it takes you to find 100% of everything you need, the greater the risk is going to be for the project or whatever is involved. And I think the other thing that you were talking about, I'll call them what they're supposed to be called. They're decision hoarders, and so they believe everything needs to come to them. But then when the decision comes to them, I think nobody really asks, like, are you actually the right person to make this call? Because like you don't know any of the technical
is
background
the
of
right
this.
person delivering? Is the right person
Yes.
delivering the question? Because you may get something that somebody is so passionate about the science. Well, no, 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 this and this. But you're looking at the data and it's like the data is telling me something different. My wallet is telling me something different, that we shouldn't do this based on what the ROI is turning into, because now there are generics hitting the market. These are things that like influence those decisions as well.
Right. So the relationship between the project manager and the project leads, you have to have a high level of trust, right? So that if there are certain decisions that have to be made, give them the flexibility to make those decisions. But at the end of the day, yes, the project manager is accountable for the outcome of the project itself. But there's going to be risk involved. Like, yes, people will make wrong decisions. But at the same time, you don't want to be the one holding up all the decisions, because it's just not a sustainable model. And having project leads own some of that, I think, empowers them to make better decisions too. So they take some of the risk on them as well. And they're able to connect with the people that are involved in the work streams to figure out, okay, let's just get all the information here. Yes, we don't all agree on this, but I think this is the best path forward. Let's just go for it and then see what happens, and then just report back to your project manager and really see how that method works versus, hey, I'm going to send an email to so-and-so, and then I'm going to set up another meeting with so-and-so, and then we're going to have to wait for a few days for the PM to get back to us. And it's like,
Right.
we've been sitting on this for weeks. Like, what are we doing?
And it's so quick to see how that timeline gets extended. I mean, we were in the middle of February. There were things that I was working on personally back in December that have still not closed the loop 2 months later, for things that probably have a low level of risk in totality. But we are right now, there's a saying that projects fail through decision ambiguity, not through incompetence. I mean, these are brilliant people, but being able to make decisions and make decisions on incomplete data, I think, is a skill. And doing that with teams that have multiple layers of ownership and accountability within the team itself, within the cross-functional team, that makes it a little bit more difficult. This person's line manager says, this is your role on the team. And then you go into the team and go, well, that's not really what everyone else thinks my role is supposed to be. These are conversations that need to be rock solid, and they need to have, you're just like in football, like you have to have trust that if we have the game plan, if we practice on what we're doing, if we're having the communication, we're not just talking about like, what's the next thing to do? We're also reflecting on like, what didn't we do? You know what? It was really messy when we made that last decision to do X. Like, how do we get away from doing that next time? And trying to invite different opinions and different ideas, even from the people that are not leads. You don't have to make these decisions alone. That's not what we're saying here. We're saying that there needs to be better clarity. There needs to be better decisions on where the authority lies, for what purpose, who can speak on the science, who speaks on the operations. And it's the responsibility of those leads to say, okay, how does this look, not just from my perspective, but how does this look from the expertise that I'm bringing, their expertise over there in the research, their expertise in the operations, and this person's expertise on the future market potential. Now, how do we make a decision? Let's give up our bias to, well, I want to do it this way because that is good project management. Well, I want to do this because, I know this science like the back of my hand. Science doesn't care what you know. It's what you can show. It's how you can drive it. It's how you can execute it. Those are the things that are going to be successful. I mean, there's been plenty of successful going all the way through that haven't been the best, medications or therapies, but because they were executed well, they had a consistent rhythm, communication, handoffs were clean, a process. Right. Hey, I want to touch just briefly on the multi-team. Forgot how you put it. It wasn't cross-functional. It was the matrix team, the matrix teams. And I think in theory, you want to, as a business, get value from the expertise that somebody holds. So you put them onto multiple programs to come in and to come out at different parts. It's kind of like having an assembly line. These people are putting the ingredients here. These people are mixing it up. These people are baking the pie. These people are getting the pie and cooling it. And these people are boxing it. And these people are driving the truck and shipping it off. They come in and they leave at whatever part of their project or that process that they're supposed to be doing. But when you're dealing with matrix teams and people that are on multiple teams, what you're now starting to do is, instead of having somebody who's dedicating 80%, even 50% if they had two programs, you're now having them split between 6 programs. So now they are 15% in on this project because I got all these other ones. And on these other ones right now, I'm at a place where I have to write a plan for that one and a document for that one. This one, we're early on, so you're not even going to hear from me much. We lose the value when we start to stretch where we're positioning people on our teams. And what's happening is that we're not taking into consideration what their priority is because of the work that they have to do, that they're expected to be a part of, that they're responsible for or held accountable for. So we introduce people into teams early on that are on 6 other teams, and it seems like they could care less about what's happening because we're so early on, when the value is that perspective. So we sort of shoot ourselves in the foot by saying, instead of having this person really dedicated to these 3 programs, let's have them be a part of all these other ones and just be a sounding board, essentially being a sounding board. And what you find is, do they get the same level of decision authority? Because they're not really in it, but they have this high level of expertise.
Yeah, I think so. The Matrix team setup would work if the person was doing the exact same thing on the exact same type of project. But just because your role is this on a project does not mean you do the same thing on every project. I think that's pretty obvious for everybody, right? Is that, yes, my title is this, but every time I go into this project, I find myself doing it's not a large, I guess, deviation from what your typical roles and responsibilities are going to be, but technically it might be that, but it's the interaction with all the different humans that you have to consider, right? It's like that takes you're interacting with a whole group of people, and to make decisions with them is not going to be the same if you take that and put it into another group, because those individuals are all different. And those people are dealing with different constraints, pressures, whatever, right? And I think that's important to note is no individual is going to ever be doing the same exact thing on 2 projects. Like it's even just limited to 2, is like your role is always going to be different. And if it is, then good for you, because we've been in this industry for so long, and I haven't even seen that.
No, not even. I mean, I even see project managers that on this project, they're doing pretty much all of the administrative, all of the scheduling, all of the taking notes, keeping actions and decisions, keeping raid logs. Over here, because they have an external partnership, that group is going to be keeping their timeline, managing their timeline. And although we have a timeline, we're not doing the science, the collaborators doing the science. So now the work is a little bit different. But in essence, what ends up happening is that when you see those things, it slowly, pulls a little bit, it disconnects you a little bit. If you can imagine, think about when I was growing up and I was, playing baseball, I wasn't always, it took a while for me to get into my skill, whether it was, I was goofy, so I didn't, run as fast or as, controlled as other people, or I swung the bat at everything. But when I was not the person, I'll be the first to tell you, I was not the person for you to come and get me in the 6th inning to go and bat, because I have probably not been paying attention for 5 innings. I mean, if you think about that, I mean, I was 9, 10, 11. I've been sitting over there for an hour and 15 minutes, not doing much. And the coaches aren't going to, hey guys, pay attention. What does that do for me? So the less I was involved, the less likely I was to be ready to take things over when it was my turn. So that's something. And I think that's just inherently, like, it's out of sight, out of mind. I'm not actively in there. I don't know the players batting. I haven't been running around. My legs are getting cold. And now I have to go in there, swing the bat, and be ready to run. Well, okay, we'll see how that goes. And then obviously as my skill got better and I was playing all the time, it's a different perspective, because I am needed at each part throughout the game for the entire 2 hours. I am in the defense. I'm in the offense. I'm, warming up somebody because they need to go into pitch and we're switching positions and blah, 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 part of the strategy. And so I think, it can be a little challenging at times when these, cross-functional teams also cross sort of responsibilities, from one project to the next. Well, here now I don't have to do anything. So how do I stay engaged in the project where now I'm not doing any of the tangible stuff? Because that's right. That's what we think that work is down to. It's just to writing down on the paper. I need to take notes. I need to do this. But there's also a part of the work that involves digesting and synthesizing what in the world is going on beyond just that, well, we're doing this and this and this. That's just listing out the tasks that are happening. Get higher than that. What is the whole purpose of the program that you're doing? Is there something that you guys are about to do that is going against what your goal is at the end of the day? What's the value there? Are you trying to find the negative? Are you trying to test against a null hypothesis or whatever? And I think so yeah, I think there's a little bit of self-preservation probably when you're going in these matrix teams and you don't have the brain capacity to do this, that, or the other because you have so many things that are just barking at you over here. And this one's more important because leadership is looking at it. Like, this is my first project. So this is my priority. I have priority here, but I have 4 people that are on other programs that leadership is most, looking at with a fine microscope. So how do I get them to be on board with me when this is not their priority? How do
I think what you're getting to is the perspective, right? From both I think from a project manager level, understanding the different individuals that are part of your team and kind of like what they're going through, and is it their first project, is it their 10th project, are they very experienced, are they not experienced? And then at a from that point of view, you really have to demonstrate, like you said, right, when you were maybe, let's say you were inexperienced, this is your first project, and let's compare that to when you were on a baseball team when you were younger. You're most likely an individual contributor. You're kind of essentially learning the ropes and trying to still build your view of how the company is working. I think when you're at a project lead or work stream lead level, you're being asked to demonstrate more of a leadership role, right? Where you're trying to build that trust among other people that are going to be putting together deliverables and executing. And then even higher above that is the project manager, right? So getting to understand the different project leads and how their relationships are with their different work streams is going to be important. And that's a huge burden for a project manager to carry, but it's also, I think, one of the places where you can have the most impact in improving how projects go cross-functionally, right? Because they have the full expansive view of all these different work streams, who's struggling, who's not, who's talking, who's being silent, what decisions are being made, what decisions are not being made. And it's really one of those like thankless jobs where like you get into this role and there's so many intangibles that they're doing that are outside of just the tangible, like tracking metrics and like putting this stupid PowerPoint.
Yeah. That's right. That was one of the first mentions that I got when I transitioned from the lab into program management. My title was a program planning manager. They essentially wanted me to help them figure out how to plan these large scale clinical trials. And there were project managers across the board, but doing it sort of together as succinctly as possible and as repeatable as possible. And one of the first comments that actually the founder said to me was, "Congratulations, you are now joining," something to the level of, "Congratulations, you're now joining the ranks of one of the most thankless jobs in the industry." And it was a pivot because in the lab, you do experiments, you process the data, you show the data. Now here's the next experiment. Boom, and do it again and cycle again, all in context of whatever goals you have. But when it came to managing the projects, it was, and being a program manager that had project managers, I was sort of this eagle eye on top to sort of create the perspective of like, this is where all the programs are different. This is where we can be the same. These are where we're challenging, we're having challenges. And it's important because you want to be able to develop a portfolio of continuity where you can exchange somebody from one project to the next to either manage or to be a part of it. and not have this super long onboarding because this project looks so much different than the other ones. It operates so much different than the other ones. But that can only be done when we take the time to really define who can make those decisions, what activities should we be concerned about, what is leadership looking for at these various stages. And if they are not clear, we have to hold their feet to the fire to get the clarity. Because what ends up happening is similar to what you find in any sort of software development. Oh, that's great. And can we add this? And can I have this? And do you guys know this? And do you guys, let's have that conversation from the beginning so that when we get to the end, we can deliver what is actually going to enable the decisions to be made. So what we've been talking about here, and we can sort of start to wrap these things up, we've identified a number of sort of threats and operational risk in cross-functional project execution, at its core. I would really put out there to the listeners, if you guys are on projects, if you guys are about to start a project, or if you're in the process of closing out a project, think about how healthy did you feel that execution? Not when you started, not right now when you're finishing, the entire space in between. Because we focus a lot on let's have a good start, let's have a good finish. But the way that you're going to win any race is going to be in the middle. These are blips in time. In the middle is really how you can maintain your endurance, how you can maintain the consistency, and how you can maintain the energy of the team. With regards to cross-functional health, we're identifying things that are risk factors, and sometimes they're hard to see because we're only seeing the symptoms. But we are talking about delays and execution risks that trace back to a number of gaps. And those can be ownership gaps, decision, issue resolution pathways that are not clear, the scope or your readiness to launch. We didn't talk about the beginning, but if you start off, you ever had a morning where nothing was working out and it sort of created this stormy cloud over your head and the rest of the day just kind of turned to crap, so those things can be said also be true to projects. If you start with ambiguity, it's going to continue. If you start with unclear expectations, unclear roles on this program, on this project, it's going to create more friction. You're just adding sand into the gears of your system that is your organization. We're talking about communication, rhythm, and transparency. It is ever so critical for these leaders, for these team leaders that are part of these projects, to maintain a level of transparency and communication. There's no malice towards your direction, your strategy. You have a perspective. Tell me about it. I'm going to tell you about my perspective. Let's work on absorbing each other's perspectives and find out, okay, well, what is the best approach to this decision? And if we can't make a decision, or if we're at a stalemate, we should have an escalation pathway that doesn't take a 3-week meeting to set up, that we can come have 30-minute conversation. Here's how I feel. Here's how they feel. Here's the information we have to make this decision. And here's the risk or the value associated with making that decision. And then the handoffs and wrapping up. We are doing projects that involve a lot of different hands and a lot of different people. And, one of the things I learned about parenting is you will get a lot of feedback. If I could recommend something, we're having our 3rd child now, and we will still get, hey, have you tried this? Hey, have you tried that? Don't be defensive. Let it come in. You can do whatever you want. But when you are the one that's in the project, in the thick of it, you work with your team. My team is my wife. My team is my 2 younger kids. My team is our circle of families that help us, babysit here and there. But that only works because we're communicating, because we understand our role, because we're making decisions together, because we're understanding and aligning what this looks like. Launch readiness, we're doing that now. We're getting ready. Hey, when we have to go to the hospital, the kids go here. We have overnight bags to go there. Then we're going to do X, Y, Z. Like, all of this is a project too. So, there's so many areas that we gloss over because we start to point at people and say they don't know their job, they don't know their role, they don't. Unfortunately, the majority of people probably don't, because it hasn't been written out, it hasn't been discussed, and that's what we're talking about. And that's, we're fortunate that we have been spending our, the most recent part of our professional careers examining and understanding more about what it means to run good projects, have good data, have good governance, finding, understanding more about facilities and manufacturing and how these pieces together work like a system. I think it's important for us to recognize and understand what these things mean beyond symptoms of, well, we didn't get that document in time. Well, we didn't have the right vendor. Those are the symptoms that usually trace back to one of these 5 operational risk areas related to cross-functional project health and execution that we talked about today.
Yeah, and then the final thing I'll add is, to your point about people, I think what's helped me and probably you as well is this mindset shift of, people aren't perfect. We're not perfect. You're going to make a bad decision. You're not going to know something. It's impossible for somebody to know everything. And I think if you approach projects in that sort of mindset and being open to communicating those things, I think people will reciprocate. And that flow of not just communication, but the project has a change in feel to it as well. I feel like when teams are more open about those things, I think they tend to talk more casually, and it's a much lighter atmosphere. And yes, there's something very important that we have to do together, but it doesn't mean I personally attack you for like doing something wrong or missing a deadline. It's like focus on the problem, not the person, I think is what I'm trying to say.
That's absolutely right. And I love that. You really do create, when you execute, and not just in the beginning, throughout the entire project, and you're addressing these areas that can become operational risk at your organization, you start to generate and develop a culture within that project of, we are open with the things that are challenging us. And what does that mean? That means when you have something coming up, you don't just say, yeah, I'll take care of it. And it's something that's way in the back of your mind that you're stressed about, that, you can say, hey, I have a lot of, deliverables here. I'm hearing this. I can't start on it until next week. I'd love to sit with you and tell you what I'm thinking so that when I do start it, we don't have any speed bumps. These are sort of that proactive thinking that when you're involved in a project team and you've really established that team feeling, you should be able to have these kind of candid conversations. And like you said, get it back to feeling like you're talking to colleagues and not like you're directing soldiers that can only act or respond to certain things. Everybody should be heard. Everybody should be feel open to discuss and to say the things that they're concerned about. And those things should be taken seriously because, like you said, we're not all perfect and we're all trying to make things successful. If you're trying to crash things, this is not the company to do that. This is not the business to be doing that. You should be, I don't know, do demolition derby or something. That's where you can actually crash stuff.
Go kick rock somewhere else.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, thanks, cross-functional project execution. So how are we connecting with multiple disciplines, multiple technical expertise and management expertise, and executing the projects? And what do those risks actually look like at its foundation? Not the symptoms, the actual operational risk. Thank you for spending your time with us today.
Long day.
We truly appreciate, there we go. We truly appreciate you being part of the Lean by Design community. If this conversation resonated with you, we invite you to check out our new book, Predictably Broken, that launches February 25th. Launches in 2 weeks. The book launches. Pre-sale is now available. And we unpack these patterns of operational friction that quietly slow teams down and what to do about it. And if you're ready to take the next step, explore our operational risk assessments. We have everything that we've talked about today is captured in our cross-functional project execution assessment. These are hybrid engagements where you're going to actually work directly with Lawrence and I to identify, prioritize, and clearly communicate the friction points in your organizations so that you can move forward with confidence and alignment. So don't forget to follow us on Instagram at SciGuy_insights. That's SciGuy Insights with an underscore in between. And if you can, and you can now watch the podcast on YouTube at Lean by Design Podcast. All the links are in the show notes. We'll see you next time. Thanks, Lawrence.
Bye.